There is an emotion so powerful, so devastating, that we will do almost anything to avoid feeling it. It lives in the darkest corners of our psyche, hidden even from ourselves. We build elaborate defenses against it. We construct entire personalities to protect ourselves from its touch. We lie, we hide, we perform, we pretend, all to keep this feeling at bay. This emotion is shame, and it is perhaps the most overlooked yet most influential force shaping human psychology. Shame is not simply embarrassment. It is not mere discomfort or social awkwardness. Shame strikes at the very core of our being. It whispers a terrible message that echoes in the deepest chambers of the soul. There is something fundamentally wrong with you, not with what you did, but with who you are. You are defective. You are unworthy. You are, at your essence, unacceptable. The philosopher and psychiatrist Carl Jung wrote that shame is the swampland of the soul. It is the place we refuse to look, the territory we mark as forbidden even to ourselves. And yet, this swampland holds secrets about who we are, about how we became who we are, and about the invisible chains that bind us to patterns of behavior we cannot understand. Why do we hide our true selves? Why do we wear masks even when we are alone? Why do certain moments from our past haunt us with an intensity that defies rational explanation? Why can a single look, a single word, a single moment of exposure reduce us to that terrified child who believes they are fundamentally wrong? The psychology of shame is a journey into the hidden architecture of the self, where we discover the wounds that shaped us and the defenses we built to survive. Shame versus guilt, the crucial distinction. Before we can understand shame, we must distinguish it from its close cousin, guilt. These two emotions are often confused, used interchangeably in common speech, but psychologically they are fundamentally different. And this difference is not merely semantic. It determines how we relate to ourselves, how we heal, and whether we can grow or remain trapped in cycles of self-destruction. Guilt says, I did something bad. Shame says, I am bad. Guilt is about behavior. Shame is about identity. Guilt focuses on the action and its consequences. Shame focuses on the self and its fundamental worthiness. When we feel guilty, we can make amends, we can change our behavior, we can apologize and repair. But shame offers no such path. How do you apologize for existing? How do you repair what you fundamentally are? The psychologist Brené Brown, who has studied shame extensively, describes it this way. Shame is the intensely painful feeling that we are unworthy of love and belonging. It is the fear that if people really knew us, truly saw us, they would reject us. This is why shame drives us into hiding, into secrecy, into the construction of false selves that we present to the world, while our true selves remain locked away where no one, not even we ourselves, can see them. Consider the phenomenology of shame. When we experience guilt, we can speak about it. We can say, I did something wrong. I hurt someone. I made a mistake. The act becomes an object we can examine, discuss, learn from. But shame resists language. Try to speak about shame and the words catch in your throat. The feeling itself seems to forbid its own expression. Shame wants to remain hidden. It thrives in darkness, in silence, in the spaces between words. This is why shame is so difficult to heal. You cannot address what you cannot name. You cannot transform what remains hidden. Shame creates a double bind. The very thing that would help us, speaking about our shame, is the thing shame most powerfully prevents. We fear that if we reveal our shame, we will be met with confirmation of our unworthiness, and so we hide, and in hiding, the shame grows stronger, more certain of its terrible message. The German philosopher Martin Heidegger spoke of authenticity, of being true to oneself rather than conforming to the anonymous they. But what Heidegger did not fully explore is how shame stands as perhaps the greatest barrier to authenticity. We cannot be authentic when we believe that our authentic self is shameful, is wrong, is unacceptable. Authenticity requires us to show ourselves as we are, but shame insists that what we are must remain hidden at all costs. The origins of shame, evolutionary and developmental. Shame, like all emotions, has evolutionary roots, but unlike fear or anger, which have clear survival functions, shame's evolutionary purpose is more complex and more social. To understand shame, we must understand that humans are fundamentally social creatures. Our survival, throughout our evolutionary history, depended not just on individual strength or intelligence, but on our ability to maintain membership in the group. Exile from the tribe meant death. In the ancestral environment, a human alone could not survive for long. We needed the protection of the group, the shared resources, the collective knowledge, and so evolution wired us with powerful emotions designed to maintain social bonds. Shame is one of these emotions. It is the feeling that arises when we sense that we might be excluded, that we might be cast out, that we are in danger of losing our place in the social order. From this perspective, shame is a social emotion, perhaps the social emotion. It regulates behavior by making us acutely aware of how we appear in the eyes of others. It creates conformity by making deviation painful. It maintains group cohesion by punishing those who step outside accepted norms. In small tribal groups where everyone knew everyone, where reputation was everything, shame was a powerful tool for social control. But the shame we carry as adults often has roots that go much deeper than evolutionary programming. It begins in childhood, in those crucial years when we are forming our sense of self, when we are learning who we are by watching how others respond to us. The psychoanalyst Erik Erikson identified shame as one of the fundamental crises of early childhood, the stage he called autonomy versus shame and doubt. A child is exploring, testing boundaries, asserting their will, and in these moments of assertion, they are vulnerable. If their exploration is met with harsh judgment, if their mistakes are treated as evidence of fundamental defectiveness, if their needs are shamed rather than met, something devastating happens. The child learns that who they are in their natural state is wrong. They learn that their authentic impulses, their genuine needs, their true self must be hidden and controlled. The developmental psychologist Donald Winnicott spoke of the true self and the false self. The true self is spontaneous, creative, alive. It is who we are before we learn to perform, before we learn to hide. The false self is the adaptation we create to meet the demands of others, to be acceptable, to avoid shame. Children who grow up in environments where their true self is consistently shamed learn to live almost entirely from the false self. The true self goes into hiding, sometimes so deep that even the person themselves forgets it exists. This is the tragedy of developmental shame. It does not simply create discomfort. It fundamentally distorts the structure of the self. We learn to be strangers to ourselves, to fear our own depths, to police our own authenticity. The shadow of shame. Jungian perspective. Carl Jung understood that we are not born with a shadow. We create it through the process of becoming acceptable to the world. The shadow is everything we have disowned, everything we have pushed into the unconscious because we learned it was unacceptable. And shame is the mechanism by which this disowning occurs. In childhood, we arrive as whole beings, containing the full spectrum of human possibility. We are greedy and generous, angry and loving, selfish and compassionate. We are everything. But our caregivers, our culture, our social environments cannot accept this wholeness. They need us to be good, to be acceptable, to fit into the roles they have prepared for us. And so the sorting begins. Certain parts of us receive approval. These parts are reinforced, encouraged, allowed to develop. They become what Jung called the persona, the mask we show to the world, the acceptable self. But other parts receive disapproval. They are met with shame. And shame, that unbearable feeling of being fundamentally wrong, teaches us to disown these parts. to push them into the darkness, to pretend they do not exist. This is how the shadow forms. It is not simply our capacity for evil or our base instincts. It is everything we learned was unacceptable. For some people, the shadow contains their anger, their aggression, their capacity to say no. For others, it contains their vulnerability, their neediness, their desire for connection. The specific content varies, but the mechanism is the same. Shame marks certain aspects of our being as forbidden, and we bury them alive in the unconscious. But what we bury does not die. It continues to live in the shadow, often growing more extreme in the darkness. The anger we were shamed for expressing as children does not disappear. It festers, sometimes emerging in passive-aggressive behavior, sometimes in sudden explosions that seem to come from nowhere, sometimes in depression, which is often anger turned inward. The neediness we were shamed for showing does not vanish. It continues to operate, but now unconsciously, driving us into relationships where we cannot admit what we need, where we manipulate rather than ask, where we suffer rather than be vulnerable. Jung taught that integration of the shadow is essential for psychological wholeness. But to integrate the shadow, we must first acknowledge it. And to acknowledge it, we must face the shame that drove it into hiding. This is why shadow work is so difficult. It requires us to look at precisely what we have spent our entire lives avoiding. It asks us to feel the shame we have organized our existence around not feeling. Consider what happens when someone points out a quality in us that we have disowned that lives in our shadow. We do not respond rationally. We do not calmly consider whether the observation is accurate. Instead, we react with intense emotion, often anger or defensiveness. This reaction is shame being triggered. The person has touched something we cannot bear to acknowledge about ourselves. They have threatened the carefully constructed persona we have built. They have aimed light at the shadow. The Jungian analyst Marion Woodman wrote that the body is the repository of shame. When we disown parts of ourselves, when we push aspects of our being into the shadow, these disowned parts do not simply vanish into abstraction. They remain encoded in the body, held in chronic muscle tension, in restricted breathing, in the inability to make eye contact, in the constant monitoring of how we are being perceived. Shame lives in the body as a perpetual contraction, a pulling away from full presence. Watch people who carry deep shame. Their shoulders curve inward, as if protecting the heart. Their gaze often cannot hold steady contact with others. Their breath is shallow. Their movements may be either overly controlled or oddly disconnected, as if they are not fully inhabiting their physical form. The body knows the truth that consciousness denies. The body remembers the shame even when the mind has repressed the memories. Shame and the authentic self. Existential crisis. The existentialists understood something profound about shame. Jean-Paul Sartre, in his phenomenological analysis of human consciousness, identified shame as the emotion that arises when we become aware of ourselves as objects in the perception of another. His famous example is of someone caught looking through a keyhole. In the moment before being caught, the person is purely absorbed in looking, in being a subject. But when they hear footsteps and realize they are being observed, everything changes. Suddenly, they see themselves as the other sees them, as an object, as a voyeur, as someone engaged in shameful behavior. But Sartre went deeper. He recognized that this structure, this capacity to see ourselves as others see us, is fundamental to human consciousness. We are, he said, beings for ourselves and beings for others simultaneously. We cannot escape the gaze of the other, and we cannot escape seeing ourselves through that gaze. Shame, then, is not an aberration. It is intrinsic to human self-consciousness. This creates an existential dilemma. To be human is to be seen, to exist in the perception of others. But to be seen is to risk shame, to risk being judged as inadequate, as unworthy, as fundamentally wrong. The temptation, then, is to control how we are seen, to craft a presentation of self that will be acceptable, that will shield us from shame. We become, in Sartre's terms, people of bad faith, denying our freedom and our authentic being in order to become what we think others need us to be. But here is the trap. In fleeing from the possibility of shame, we guarantee a deeper shame. We shame ourselves. We reject our own authentic being. We live as imposters in our own lives, and somewhere deep within, we know it. The philosopher Martin Heidegger spoke of authenticity, of Dasein existing in its own most possibility. But shame pulls us away from authenticity. It teaches us that our almost possibility is unacceptable, that we must hide it, deny it, become something else. Shame convinces us that survival requires self-betrayal. This is the existential dimension of shame. It is not merely an uncomfortable feeling. It is a force that shapes our fundamental relationship with existence. Do we dare to exist authentically, accepting the risk of shame, of rejection, of being seen and found wanting? Or do we choose safety, constructing an acceptable false self, living at a distance from our own being? Kierkegaard, the father of existentialism, wrote about the despair of not willing to be oneself. This despair, he argued, is the sickness unto death, a spiritual condition where we are dying while still alive. And what is the cause of this despair? Often it is shame. We have learned that being ourselves is dangerous, that it will result in rejection, in abandonment, in that unbearable feeling of fundamental wrongness. And so we choose not to be ourselves. We choose despair over shame, not realizing that this choice creates a deeper, more insidious shame. The tragedy is that we can never fully succeed in this project. We can never completely erase our authentic self. It continues to exist, suppressed but present, sending signals that something is wrong, that we are living a lie. We feel empty despite our achievements. We feel isolated despite being surrounded by people who admire our persona. We feel a nameless longing for something we cannot identify. This is the authentic self, exiled but not dead, calling to us from the depths. Rollo May, the existential psychologist, understood that anxiety and shame are intimately connected. Anxiety, he taught, is the response to the possibility of non-being, to the threat of ceasing to exist. But shame triggers a specific kind of existential anxiety. It threatens not physical death, but psychological annihilation. It threatens the death of the self as acceptable, as worthy of existing in the social world. And for a social species like humans, this psychological death can feel more threatening than physical death, the neurobiology of shame. Modern neuroscience has begun to map the neural architecture of shame, and what we discover there confirms what philosophers and psychologists have long understood. Shame is not simply a thought or a belief. It is a full-body, full-brain response that activates some of the most primitive and powerful circuits in our nervous system. When we experience shame, the autonomic nervous system responds as it would to mortal danger. The parasympathetic nervous system may activate, causing us to freeze, to collapse inward, to become small and still. This is the biological basis of the shame posture, the hunched shoulders, the downcast eyes, the desire to disappear. Or the sympathetic nervous system may activate, flooding us with adrenaline, preparing us for fight or flight. This is why shame can quickly transform into rage, into desperate attacks on others who have triggered the feeling. Brain imaging studies reveal that shame activates regions associated with pain processing, particularly the anterior cingulate cortex. The brain processes shame as it processes physical pain. This is not metaphorical. The suffering of shame is registered in the same neural circuits that register the suffering of injury. When we say that shame hurts, we are describing a neurological reality, but there is more. Shame also activates the amygdala, the brain's alarm system, the structure that detects threat and initiates the stress response, and it deactivates parts of the prefrontal cortex, the regions associated with rational thought and emotional regulation. This is why, when we are in the grip of shame, we cannot think clearly. We cannot access perspective or reason. We are flooded with a sense of threat that overwhelms our capacity for reflection. Researchers have also discovered that chronic shame alters the brain structure over time. People who carry persistent shame show changes in the connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system, the emotional centers of the brain. They show alterations in the default mode network, the neural circuits active when we are at rest, thinking about ourselves and others. Shame, when chronic, becomes not just an occasional experience but a constant background state, a lens through which all experience is filtered. The neurochemistry of shame is equally revealing. Shame is associated with decreased levels of serotonin and dopamine, the neurotransmitters involved in mood regulation and reward processing. This is why shame and depression are so intimately connected. Shame literally depletes the brain's capacity for experiencing pleasure, for feeling motivated, for seeing possibility. It creates a neurochemical environment of hopelessness and withdrawal. But perhaps most significant is shame's relationship to the social brain, the neural networks that evolve to help us navigate relationships and social hierarchies. When we experience shame, there is increased activity in regions associated with mentalizing, with thinking about what others are thinking about us. The brain becomes hypervigilant to social threat, constantly scanning for signs of judgment, of rejection, of disapproval. This hypervigilance creates a vicious cycle. We become so attuned to potential shame that we perceive it even where it does not exist. A neutral expression becomes a judgment. A moment of distraction becomes rejection. We live in a state of perpetual social threat, our nervous system never fully relaxing, never feeling safe. And this chronic activation of the stress response has profound effects on physical health, contributing to inflammation, cardiovascular disease, immune dysfunction, and accelerated aging. The neuroscience of shame reveals something crucial. Shame is not weakness. It is not something we should simply overcome through willpower or positive thinking. It is a deep neurobiological response shaped by evolution and by our individual developmental history, encoded in the structure and function of our brains and bodies. Beyond shame, integration, and wholeness. If shame is so deeply wired into our biology, if it is encoded in our neural circuits and our developmental history, if it shapes our very sense of self, then what hope is there for liberation? This is the question that haunts anyone who has truly confronted the depth of shame's hold on human psychology. The answer is not simple, and anyone who offers easy solutions has not understood the problem. Moving beyond shame is not about positive affirmations or self-esteem exercises. It is not about pretending the shame does not exist or talking ourselves out of it with rational arguments. Shame exists at a level deeper than rational thought, and it can only be addressed at that same depth. Jung's concept of integration offers a pathway. To integrate shame means first to acknowledge it, to bring into consciousness what has been hidden. This requires tremendous courage. It means looking at the parts of ourselves we have spent our lives avoiding, feeling the feelings we have organized our existence around not feeling. It means sitting with the unbearable sensation of being fundamentally wrong without immediately fleeing into defense or distraction. But acknowledgement alone is not enough. We must also understand the origins of our shame. Where did we learn that we were unacceptable? Whose voice first told us we were wrong? What specific experiences encoded this message into our nervous system? This archaeological work, this excavation of the past, is not about blaming others or dwelling in victimhood. It is about seeing clearly, about understanding that the shame we carry is not truth, but a learned response, a message we internalized but did not author. The psychologist Donna Winnicott spoke of the true self and the false self. The false self is constructed to be acceptable, to avoid shame, to earn love through performance. But beneath this false self, the true self continues to exist, waiting to be recognized, waiting to be allowed into the light. Healing shame means gradually allowing this true self to emerge, risking the vulnerability of being seen as we actually are. This process requires what shame researcher Brené Brown calls vulnerability. We must be willing to be seen, truly seen in our imperfection, in our ordinariness, in our humanness. And here is the paradox. The very thing shame tells us will destroy us, being fully seen, is actually what liberates us. When we risk being known and discover that we are still accepted, still loved, still worthy, the power of shame begins to dissolve. But this cannot happen in isolation. Shame thrives in secrecy, in hiding, in the belief that we are alone in our unworthiness. The antidote to shame, therefore, is connection. Not the superficial connection of masks meeting masks, but genuine human connection where we risk showing our hidden selves and experience acceptance. This is why therapy, why genuine friendship, why authentic community can be so healing. They provide the relational context in which shame can be metabolized. The Buddhist teacher Pema Chodron speaks of meeting our edge, that place where we encounter what we cannot bear to face. Shame is often at this edge. Learning to stay present when shame arises, neither fleeing into distraction nor collapsing into self-hatred, is a practice. It is the practice of compassion for ourselves, of recognizing that this shame is not truth but pain, and pain deserves compassion, not judgment. This compassion must extend to understanding shame's original function. Shame evolved to keep us connected to our social groups, to alert us when we risked rejection. In its origins, it was not the enemy, but a guardian, protecting us from isolation and death. The problem is not shame itself, but toxic shame. Shame that has become internalized as identity rather than remaining a signal about behavior. We can learn to distinguish between healthy shame, which alerts us when our behavior violates our values, and toxic shame, which tells us our very existence is wrong. We can learn to respond to healthy shame with appropriate action, making amends or changing behavior, while recognizing toxic shame as a wound requiring healing rather than a truth requiring belief. The path beyond shame also requires reclaiming the body, because shame lives in the body as chronic tension and contraction. Healing must include somatic work. This might mean learning to breathe fully again, to relax the perpetual bracing against exposure. It might mean movement practices that help us inhabit our bodies with less fear and more presence. It might mean touch, appropriate therapeutic touch, that communicates acceptance of our physical being. There is also the work of rewriting our internal narrative. The story shame tells is simple. You are fundamentally flawed and unworthy. But this story, however convincing it feels, is not factual. It is a construction built from specific experiences and messages, maintained by selective attention and confirmation bias. We can learn to see this story as a story, not as reality. We can begin to author a different narrative, one that includes our wounds but is not defined by them, one that acknowledges our imperfection while affirming our fundamental worthiness. Nietzsche spoke of amor fati, love of fate, the radical acceptance of everything that has happened to us. This does not mean approving of harm or pretending wounds do not matter. It means recognizing that our history, including our shame, has shaped us. We can choose to let it break us, or we can choose to let it break us open, cracking the shell of the false self and allowing something more authentic to emerge. The great spiritual traditions have long understood that transformation requires descent. We must go down into the darkness, into the hidden places, into the shame we have carried. This descent is not pleasant. It is not comfortable, but it is necessary. Only by facing what we have hidden can we integrate it. Only by feeling what we have avoided can we move through it. Only by acknowledging our woundedness can we discover our wholeness. Conclusion: shame is the hidden emotion, not because it is rare, but because we hide it, even from ourselves. It operates in the shadows of consciousness, shaping our choices, limiting our possibilities, keeping us imprisoned in false versions of ourselves. It whispers that we must hide, that exposure means annihilation, that safety lies in never being truly known. But this whisper is a lie, or at least a partial truth that has outlived its usefulness. The shame that once protected us from social rejection now protects us from authentic living. The armor that once kept us safe now keeps us isolated. The masks that once earned approval now prevent genuine connection. Moving beyond shame is not a single act, but a lifelong practice. It is the practice of bringing consciousness to what has been unconscious, of extending compassion to what we have judged, of risking vulnerability when everything in us screams for safety. It is the practice of gradually, patiently, courageously allowing ourselves to be seen, to be known, to exist as we are, rather than as we think we should be. This journey is not easy. There will be moments of regression, times when the old shame patterns reassert themselves, when we find ourselves hiding again, performing again, betraying ourselves again. This is not failure. This is the nature of deep psychological work. We do not heal in a straight line. We spiral, returning to familiar territory but from new perspectives, with new understanding, with greater capacity to stay present with what was once unbearable. The person who carries shame is not broken. They are wounded, and wounds can heal. The healing requires time, requires patience, requires safe relationships, requires the courage to face what has been hidden. But it is possible. Thousands of people have walked this path before you. Thousands more walk it now. You are not alone in the struggle, even when shame tells you that you are. Integration of shame does not mean the feeling disappears completely. It means it no longer controls us. It means we can feel it without believing it. It means we recognize it as a signal, not as truth. It means we can be vulnerable without being destroyed, authentic without being rejected, whole rather than acceptable. This is the promise and the challenge. We can live differently. We can be free. Not free from ever feeling shame, but free from shame's tyranny, from its power to dictate who we must be and who we must hide. We can discover that beneath the shame, beneath the false self, beneath the persona and the performance, something genuine exists, something worthy, something whole. And in discovering this, we discover something even more profound. We are not our shame. We never were. We are the consciousness that can witness shame, that can feel it without being consumed by it, that can choose moment by moment whether to believe its message or to recognize it as the echo of old wounds, deserving of compassion but no longer deserving of obedience. This is liberation. Not the absence of shame, but freedom from its prison. Not perfection, but authenticity. Not the end of the journey, but the beginning of truly living. Call to action. If these words have touched something in you, if you recognize yourself in this exploration of shame, know that recognition itself is the beginning of healing. Shame thrives in darkness and isolation. By bringing it into the light of awareness, by naming it, by seeing it clearly, you have already begun the work of transformation. Subscribe to this channel if you hunger for content that explores the depths of human psychology with honesty and compassion, that does not offer easy answers, but invites you into genuine inquiry. Share this with someone who might be carrying shame in silence, who might need to know they are not alone. Leave a comment if you wish, sharing your reflections or your struggles. This community exists for those willing to do the difficult work of becoming whole. Remember, the path beyond shame is not walked alone. We are in this together, all of us wounded, all of us healing, all of us learning to be human with less hiding and more truth.